Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. We look at the task of the muhaddith. Many a time we see that it is restricted to hadith and in specific to authenticating narrations. At the highest point, and some just say that muhaddith is the one that relates hadith. But the reality of this situation is that the task of the muhaddith, or actually we should say ulum al-hadith, or the sciences of hadith, give us the critical skills that are necessary for engaging in high level research. The methodology of the muhaddith is a critical methodology and is concerned with authentication, but it doesn't end at that. From the contemporary ulama that have pointed out this reality is Dr. Hamza al-Malibari, who talked about the role of the muhaddith in the highest level of hadith sciences being extracting fiqh from the hadith. And we see that to be very true. It's not an exaggerated claim that the task of the muhaddith indeed in the end is to understand and not just to authenticate. We see that in Bukhari, we see that in Tirmidhi, we see that in a number of ulama. They produce fiqh, showing us then that the task of the muhaddith is not just what? Not just authenticating narrations, but it's also coming to an understanding of those narrations and how they relate to one another. In any event, the sciences of hadith provide us the methodology that we need to engage in critical research, along with usul al-fiqh. But I want to focus on the importance of the muhaddith because the muhaddith also is a historian. We see in the example of Imam Ibn Kathir, Imam al-Dhahabi, Imam Ibn Jarir al-Tabari, we see that they focused on history as well. Now, they may have not applied the same criteria that they use in hadith to historical reports, but we see that they were critical thinkers. Imam Ibn Khaldun comes later on and he compiles his muqaddimah as a philosophy of history, a philosophy of his history. But the philosophy is not focused only on history, because in the muqaddimah he talks about the relationship of reason to intellect. He talks about the rise and fall of civilization. He talks about the various sciences or the various branches of knowledge which uphold civilization, right? He talks about education. He talks about understanding peoples and cultures and customs. In fact, Imam Ibn Khaldun in his treatise, the Muqaddimah, the introduction to his history, laid down an understanding which has taken the Western University about 5 or 6 departments to be able to unpack his concept. And they have done it in a way in which there is no interdisciplinary cooperation. So Imam Ibn Khaldun is working with multiple disciplines. He's a polymath, of course, rahmatullahi alayh. He's working with multiple disciplines in his text. He's working with sociology, anthropology, political science, psychology, geography, history, the sciences of hadith, the philosophy of education, economy, right? And so you find that these are related to civilization and political science and ultimately to the Qur'an itself. The life of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, as exemplified in the article written by Dr. Sherman Jackson, which is an explication of some of the ideas of Imam al-Qarafi rahimahullah, the article From Prophetic Action to Constitutional Theory, we see that the idea of the Sunnah is one which is comprehensive, or the acts of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, they what address the whole of life, the whole of life. So the reality is that the person of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is one which dealt with the whole of life, showing us that Deen deals with the whole of life. But if we are able to benefit from anything, is in reviewing that which the ulama have said in the past and history, and trying to see where we can gain experience, where we can gain experience. Dr. Yasser Auda, in his introduction to Maqasid of the Sharia, the objectives of the Sharia, he noted that Sheikh Muhammad Ghazali al-Azhari, rahmatullahi alayhi, saw that it was an objective for the Muslims to look at Islamic history and learn from its mistakes, to gain insight, so that we can build a new future. If we look at the philosophy of Imam Ibn Khaldun wants us to what? To look at human history as a whole, civilizations and peoples, and learn what works and what doesn't work in light of the Quran. So the role of history in seeing what is essential is very important. If we look at the fact that Islam legislates zakat, and we don't understand the wisdom behind it, we may make some mistakes. We may neglect this practice, even though it's sinful to neglect. But this is the reality of human nature, falling short. But when we begin to understand the importance of zakat, as Allah has commanded us to reflect in the Quran, to reflect on ourselves, to reflect on life. وَالْعَصْرِ إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَفِي خُسْرٍ. Is that not a testification to the need to look at history itself, to see how humanity is at a loss unless certain principles are upheld, certain values, like education and justice and belief in Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala? Right? So society is built on this, right? Like self-discipline and the path of reform. When we look at a study like that of Dr. Jared Diamond in his book Collapse, and he also did a video series on YouTube, he notes that societies collapse because the rich insulate themselves from the needs of the poor and begin to get richer, 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 and don't heed the need of the poor or the needs. So society becomes more and more corrupt. Nature eventually is ripped off or is raped. And this leads to the inability of a people to be able to maintain themselves. Some people, when they look at the fact that Allah wa ta'ala is a razik, they don't understand how it is that there can be poverty in the world. Well, here it is that there is injustice in the world as well, because human beings are charged by the very Quran that tells them that Allah is a razik, that rizq is from Allah, to be just in the dunya, to heed the needs of the poor. So that study in and of itself, Collapse, shows us the wisdom behind zakat and how nations, when they don't implement this reality, begin to decline and collapse. When there's an unrestricted accumulation of wealth without a regard for what? For others, without a regard for the unseen. Without regard for values, without regard for the meaning of life. That life means accountability and responsibility. Right? Responsibility is not just our ability to respond, but responsibility in the Quranic sense, unlike what we find in Stephen Covey. Responsibility is what? Our ability to respond. Right? Our ability to make what? A choice not to be determined. Right? Unlike Stephen Covey, we build further. It means that we are accountable before Allah for our deeds. Those deeds are not left without being checked and examined and rewarded. Either what? The reward of punishment, or what? The reward of blessing. Human action then is accounted for. There's accountability with responsibility. With freedom. With freedom, there's responsibility. And this is an important lesson in democracy. That freedom unrestricted, freedom without accountability leads to disastrous ends. Right? When we don't have any regard for society, when we don't have any regard for ourselves. And this is the challenge that we're in the society and the time that we live in. That we ourselves have to call ourselves to a higher standard because materialism by itself leaves us restricted only to the animalistic plane, whereas the deen as a whole, it speaks to a higher reality, a more comprehensive reality, right? The deen speaks to intellect, it speaks to the heart, and it speaks to the body, to the whole of human existence. Iman, Islam, Ihsan. That is the deen. When the deen speaks to the whole of reality, right? When our discourse, in other words, speaks to the whole reality, then is one that's representative of the deen. So Islamic thought and Islamic discourse has to be representative of human life. And there's no better example than to look at the model of the Prophet Muhammad wasallam and to understand what direction our thought should go in. Because that model is one which is pleasing to Allah by testification of the Quran. So sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his model is one in which what it teaches us then what is the role of intellect and what is the role of action, what is the role of time, what is the role of wealth, what is the role of desire, what is the role of culture, what is the role of revelation. Everything has its place. But still, because everything has its place doesn't mean that we have no task before us. The task before us is to make good choices, or as they say, healthy choices. Healthy spiritually, smart choices, right? Intellectually, right? And materially. And that decision-making process should be guided by the values of the Quran. When we take a lesson from history, as the Quran so often asks us to reflect on the nations that came before us, whether it's Fir'aun or Ad or Qarun or Abu Lahab or the Munafiqeen, the Quran is a book which encourages us to understand history. So then we are in need of a methodology of reflection. So in learning how to develop that methodology, why not begin with our elders? Why not begin with the Muqaddimah of Ibn Khaldun? And see then what Quranic thinking and research has produced. Because after all, as is evidenced by many researchers into Ibn Khaldun is representative of a Quranic spirit. So then the task of the Muhaddith is also the task of the historian. And when we look at Ibn Khaldun, we begin to understand the task of the historian. And when we understand the Quranic methodology overall, we understand the reality of the Sunnah, because the Quran enjoins us to follow the Prophet Muhammad. So the Quranic methodology of reflection, when we see the life of the Prophet Muhammad, we see that thought, then we should reflect on the whole of life. And the whole of life, we're given guidance in it by the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad. So then history teaches us what to avoid pitfalls and failures. History teaches us the wisdom in following the Prophet ﷺ and what comes as far as destruction is concerned. If we take the lesson of zakat by itself and we look at the research of why societies collapse, then we understand the wisdom in being concerned with the poor in society and its growth. Because when we fail to uphold those principles, we find that what? We undermine human dignity. And when we find ourselves in an existence which is just rooted in animal nature, we find ourselves again in a self-destructive tendency. So we need a revival of culture, one that will breathe life into the culture and civilization once again, and encourage the best of humanity. No one is perfect except the prophets, and they were guided by Allah alayhi salam. They were guided by Allah. So the guidance that we have before us in reviving Islamic thought is to return to principles that are there among our ulama and see how we can rework them and see how we can benefit from history so that we better ourselves. And what better place to start with the idea of pleasing Allah, with the idea of the need for self reform, with the idea of the need to be concerned for society. What better place to start than the Quran, than the Muqaddimah of Ibn Khaldun in history, so that we can gain an insight into what works and what doesn't, and be those who respect the wisdom of Allah Ta'ala, as is manifest in the patterns that are laid out that govern society and that govern history and time. Allahu a'lam aqulu qawli hadha wa astaghfiru li wa lakum.